Hello, this is How to Write Good, and I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. You can check out the other stuff I'm doing, I guess. You can check out my book, The Ninth Hour, on Amazon. Check it out there if you want to. You can check out my serialized story coming out called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. If you are new, you can find it on this feed. You can find it on its other feed. If you don't like my voice, you can read it on my website. My website is danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. And then you just type One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet into the search bar. It's a tag. It's a tag on the website. You should be able to see all of them. I don't know what number I'm up to. I'm thinking it's 5 that are out. The 6th one I'm expecting to come out on the 12th, which I believe is a Sunday. So there you go. Check those things out. Got some other stuff in the works, not story-wise, but a few other things. If you want to follow me, just go to my website, and there's links to the stupid social media stuff. I do the most stuff on Instagram because I'm sick of writing stuff. You know, I don't want to have to think of an idea to type up on Facebook or Twitter. So I just do pictures because it's a nice break. Our word of the week is rhubarb. And rhubarb is a plant, first of all, if you don't know. It's like celery, but it's red, and it's the stalk of a plant that we eat. We don't eat the leaves of rhubarb. I actually think the leaves are poisonous to humans, but it's like celery, but it's sour celery. So that's what rhubarb is, and that sounds really appetizing when you think about it. But rhubarb also means a quarrel or a squabble. It's like a dispute. So that's another way you can use rhubarb. Spelled the exact same way, and I'm not sure exactly why why that second meaning exists. I'm a fan of that second meaning existing, but I have no idea why that second meaning exists. I didn't look into the etymology this week. Mainly, it's just, I don't know. Some weeks I do more with etymology, and some weeks I don't. All right, so we are going to be talking about the scientific method this week. I'm going to be talking about it this week. And when you come to a writing podcast and you think, why are you talking about the scientific method? It's because I think writing is putting thoughts into words. It's in some cases thought formation. So some people don't necessarily know what they're thinking about, and they are taking thoughts. There's a stream of consciousness when you write. So people don't have huge blocks of words in their mind at one time. Most people don't. Maybe there's some person somewhere who can contain a huge block of information or verbal information, right? So words in their mind at a specific time. So when people write something down, it's coming. They maybe have an idea, a sense of what they want to write in the future or what they want to write about, but the specific words and the way those ideas are expressed through those words, that is not contained in their mind, so it's something that is being produced while they're writing it. And where was I going with this? And when you do that, you are generally putting down you're putting down an idea that isn't fully formed in a lot of cases, because for most fiction writers, let's just say that, for most fiction writers, they are writing first drafts, and first drafts can be really, really rough if you try to be perfect. But most fiction writers who have been doing it long enough realize that they just need to vomit on the page. So when they vomit on the page, they have a lot of words, and stories need to be coherent, right? Stories need to have a specific structure to be coherent. You can vary within that structure, and I would say that you should play around with the structure, and then when you see your flaws, you should fix those flaws and try to make that story as awesome as possible, right? As entertaining as possible to people. So you have to fit it within a specific structure. And that structure, you're trying to reach for that structure, but when you're writing a first draft, when I write a first draft, let's just look at me, because it's a little easier than just talking in generalities. When I write a first draft, sometimes I write about one specific idea, and I repeat that same idea because I needed that idea to get to somewhere else in the story. So it's not coherent. It's messy. That's probably the best way to describe it. It's a messy result, and that's why you need to do revision. And revision is actually this is all thought formation, right? This whole entire process of writing is thought formation. You vomit on the page for your first draft. Then you look back and you're like, okay, what was I trying to get to with this? And in some cases, you actually switch what you're trying to get to. And in a lot of cases, you're just refining stuff. so it flows better, it comes out better. For example, if you're in philosophy and you're trying to make an argument, you might go through your argument multiple different times just to make sure your argument is good. And you might go through your argument not necessarily to make sure your argument is good, valid, right? You might go through the argument, how it's written, just to make sure people can actually understand what's being written, which maybe needs to happen more for some philosophers, because some philosophers are very, I don't know if you'd say obtuse. They probably get to the point in their own way, but they're very difficult, and they're just very difficult to understand. So if you think about, we are going to be looking at scientific writing. We're going to be looking at science. We're going to be looking at writing, but it's going to go in this order: science, scientific writing, and then other types of writing. And I'm going to show you that science, the scientific process, the scientific method is what people call it. The scientific process, specifically the research process, is actually related to writing and what you're doing in writing. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the scientific method. And I think maybe it's not the case. I don't want to say people are scientifically illiterate, but I definitely think it's the case that people should do some scientific studies themselves. I think it's very valuable, if you ever have a chance, to take a class where you're actually conducting a study, because then you realize what you're doing in the study. I had the opportunity to do this in school because I went to school for psychology, and one of the classes that's required is a research methods class. So you have to actually go through the process of setting up a study and running the study, and then having a scientific report based on that study about your findings, which, by the way, studies that don't find anything can be just as valuable as studies that find something. Like if you disprove your point, it's actually good too, because you can at least get some information from that. But I'm kind of getting off the point right here. So how does the scientific method work, or how do you go from zero, thinking scientifically or conducting a research study, to coming up with conclusions about something with a research study? And if you are someone who's really entrenched in science, and I make an error, I'm not trying to, I'm being careful how I talk, but if I make an error, you disagree with me, you certainly can bring something up. But there's certain things in science, well, I'll get to that later. But so this is how science works, just very broadly. You are looking at something in the world, and you decide, I'm seeing this happen, right? For example, you think that people making left turns at four-way stops get in more accidents than people who, when you don't have to make a left turn at a four-way stop. Okay, so you're making an observation, and the thing I just did right there, where I said, people who are that statement where I say people turning left at four-way stops get in more accidents than people not turning left at four-way stops, that is a hypothesis, okay? That is, you're stating, I make this observation, and then I am making a specific statement that I believe to be the case. And the thing about this statement is that it is testable. Certain things aren't testable, and I think certain things aren't testable. So if you run into a statement that really isn't testable, you can't really do a scientific study on it. There's a lot of statements about the real world that are not testable, and they're typically statements that actually have to do with psychology. So if you wanted to say, if you were racist, for example, and you wanted to say that a specific race was less intelligent than another race, and it's just based on the color of the person's skin, that's going to be something very hard to test. And the reason why it's going to be really hard to test is it's going to be really hard to control for things. Okay, when you're conducting an experiment, you want everything controlled except, in that case, the race of the individuals. But there's so many factors that go into who a person is and where they've been in their life, and then there's the factor of the person thinking, that it's really, really difficult to test anything in psychology with a lot of accuracy. Because of the fact, you can do correlational studies, but it's really hard to pinpoint certain things in psychology because of the fact that people are such complex creatures. Okay, so when you're looking at that, you're making a statement that's testable, right? In terms of gravity, right? We have the theory of gravity, there was a hypothesis that objects will be attracted to other objects. And I think it's anything with matter. Objects with matter, I believe, will be attracted to any other objects with matter. Okay, and then bigger objects in that theory have a stronger gravitational pull. So if we suddenly saw that there was some object that was repelling something else, for instance, a magnet, right? If you have the same size of a magnet, if you have a negative and a negative side, it repels itself. We'd have to be like, well, and maybe we do it on a bigger scale. So maybe it's like, there's this planet and nothing can get close enough to this planet. Well, is that the theory of gravity breaking down, or is there another explanation? Okay. So when you, once you make a hypothesis, then you need to test the hypothesis. And in science, you need to control for everything except what you're testing. As I said before, if you're testing whether a specific race is more intelligent than another, and the color of the race itself, not different factors, not cultural, not anything else. If you're trying to decide that happens just because of the color of skin, you need to control for absolutely everything but the color of the skin of the people. And so in some cases, you're going to you're going to have a hypothesis, you're going to test your hypothesis, and you're going to actually it's going to go against your hypothesis. Okay. Now, in a perfect world where you controlled for everything but those two things, then you have a conclusion to your hypothesis. So you're going to have to retest and rehypothesize if it goes against your hypothesis. If it happens to be the case that it ends up, it seems to be the case that we find out if you have blonde hair, you really like apples. That's our hypothesis. A really unoffensive hypothesis just to deal with here. So let's just say we're hypothesizing that. We find out, hey, people who have blonde hair always like apples. Every single person we tested in that case likes apples who had blonde hair, and other people who had different colored hair maybe liked apples, maybe didn't, but every single person who liked blonde hair liked apples, had blonde hair, liked apples. So then we have our hypothesis. And what most people think is that the research study that is done proves a hypothesis. And this isn't necessarily the case. Your research study, if it comes out to agree with your hypothesis, if the data fits with what you're looking at, you actually are supporting your hypothesis, right? It still is the case that if we found one person who is blonde and did not like apples, that hypothesis is broken down. And we could say on average, blonde people tend to like apples more for whatever bizarre reason. But if you are stating that blonde people like apples, and it's a very black and white situation, then that hypothesis is not rejected, it's incorrect. But we're just supporting that hypothesis. So let's just think about this bigger, because I just said, blonde people on average like apples, okay? You might say, well, what if we just talk about averages? You could still run into the same case with averages. It could be the case that you test thousands of blonde people. Let's just test 20,000 blonde people. And it happens to be the case that the only fruit that grows where they live is an apple, okay? So it tends to be the case that these blonde people like apples, right? On average, these blonde people like apples because that's the only fruit that grows where they live. Now you start testing blonde people you start testing millions of blonde people. Well, then in that second test, you might actually find out that the millions of blonde people you're testing generally do not like apples. You don't have all the information. And when you're dealing with people, when you're trying to test things about people, it's really, really difficult. And it's not that the information is incorrect. It is supporting. So if you find out that your hypothesis is supported, that's good. It's supporting your hypothesis. It's saying, this is the more tests, actually retesting things in science is extremely important, because the more you can retest something and the more times you can replicate that test, the more and more support you can get. Just because there's one scientific study that says one thing does not mean it's 100% true. We need to do multiple tests. Unfortunately, in science, you don't see a lot of retesting done. as much as it should happen. We should really be doing as much retesting of different hypotheses as we can, just to make sure those hypotheses are correct. Because if you have a specific hypothesis, and that hypothesis is really supported, and then we make a theory out of that hypothesis, because a theory is it's a hypothesis that is well supported. If we make a theory out of that without doing more research on it and really testing it, then we have a theory that's not based on much. We just need more support for it. But I think that there are theories in the world that are very well supported, right? So I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that science is invalid or anything like that. I'm just saying that you do not get this absolute proof from scientific studies. Generally, you get a supported hypothesis, which shows that it's more of like a statistical value. So it's essentially saying, hey, based on what the research we're doing, there could be a chance that we're wrong, but it's very, 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 very likely that we are correct. And that's what we're getting at. So I don't like it when people say, a scientific study proved something, because you might not have all the information, and it is really supporting something. There's a difference between supporting something and proving something, and we can make assumptions about the world based on those studies, but it's a little different. So, I mean, if you're looking at Newtonian physics and you're looking at quantum physics, Einstein was looking at his world and he was saying, Newton was looking at his world, he's saying, I think this is how everything works. And he kept on seeing all these different things. Well, when you pull back and you look at a bigger picture, you're suddenly like, that doesn't fit, right? Newton had a specific theory of how everything works, and it actually wasn't the case in the bigger picture. It didn't work correctly in the bigger picture. That could be the case in a lot of things that are in science. So I'm not saying that you should just dismiss all science. I'm just saying that you should be aware of how it works. And like I said before, I'm not trying to get into the super nitty gritty. If you are somebody in science, then I would, and you think I'm wrong, you can definitely reach out for that. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. So that's kind of what you're doing with the scientific method in creating a scientific study. A quick thing, specific ideas in science can't be tested, all right? And one of the big things that can't be attested by science is science itself. Science has specific ideas, and if you try to test science's ideas, so for example, we have an assumption that that we live in a universe that's observable, and there are things outside ourselves that we can accurately measure, right? You have to make an assumption that you're not crazy, first of all, and it's really, really hard to test whether you specifically are crazy or not. And we have to make an assumption that the logical processes that underlie science, because logic does undergird science, okay? And without logic, we would have not come to the conclusion that we should go through this very systematic process to arrive at facts about our world. So logic undergirds science, but you can't test logic, and you can't test scientific paradigms. You can't test the scientific method itself using the scientific method. It's circular reasoning, or it's a circular argument or something like that. I don't know. So let's talk about this theory in relation to writing, and I think it's any type of writing, honestly. Maybe I might be wrong. I might be wrong about it being any type of writing, but just from like a glance, and just from briefly thinking about it, I think it is every type of writing. It definitely is fiction writing. I think this definitely relates to fiction writing. So when you are theorizing about something, what you're doing is you're bringing together all these different facts, and it depends on what theory you're creating, but you're bringing together all these different facts to it's kind of like making a symphony. You're bringing together all these different sounds from different instruments, and it's creating this music. And you're in a sense, when you're creating a theory, in some cases you're bringing together all these different facts, and you're synthesizing it through yourself, or distilling it through yourself, and you are creating some type of music that shows, hey, we're pretty sure this is how the world works. And when you're doing that, you need to know what is actually going to support your theory. In the case of objects, in the case of plants, in the case of animals, theories are less complex, And in the case of humans, theories become more complex because humans are more complex creatures. So I really want to focus on in the case of humans, because I don't really think we know much of anything. So Freud made a theory about how people work, and it was all based on sex, right? Everybody knows that. And he had his different stages, and he had his different stages during life. He had oral, anal, phallic, latent, and can't remember. I think there were 5. Was that it? I think latent is the last one. Latent. And he also had the idea of the id and the ego and the superego. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's essentially the inner workings of the human mind and how people work. So when you're looking at his theory, he didn't use any science to support his theory, which would be a big no-no in psychology right now. More modern times have people like B.F. Skinner, who essentially said humans work based on being rewarded or punished. He really leaned heavily on the reward in that sense. And then you have people more recently, and I think he's still alive. He might be dead, honestly. Bandura, who thought that people, there were different facets to people, and people interacted with their environment, and they interacted with their biology, and they interacted with, and then they had the personal self. So essentially people are interacting with multiple different forces to bring about their personality. But with any of those things, you really have to have, especially with the last one with Bandura, you have to bring in the biology, you have to bring in the social aspects, you have to bring in the person themselves. So when you're looking at the person himself or herself, you have to think about their own biology, you have to think about their genetics and everything like that. You have to think about the different aspects of who they are just from a biological perspective. This could be, I think this would be related to both the physical and the mental, but the physical and the mental, and I think his calculus is the same thing. So if your brain chemicals don't produce a specific thing, then you're going to react in a specific way, or maybe you have a hyperactive amygdala, so you worry more, or something like that. With the social aspect, I mean, that gets crazy because you have billions of people on the planet, and then you have millions of people in a culture group, and you have to figure out, then within that culture group, you have like a town that has like 100,000, and then a family, etc. And even it keeps on going down and down and down. So there's all these different moving pieces because there's so many different people, and that's going to affect a person too. So that gets really difficult. And then going from the personal, I can't remember what it's called. It's essentially the person themselves, himself or herself, and then you have to figure out, okay, how is that going to interact with stuff? So I'm kind of getting in the weeds right here. But what I'm essentially saying is that there's tons and tons of things that go together to be like, hey, like this is who a person is, right? In that case, Bandura was essentially theorizing, hey, humans are so complex, and I'm bringing in all these different ideas from all these different areas to support my theory that there's actually 3 different things that interact to kind of create the personality of a person or to affect a person. Okay, so what he had to do is he had to figure out if he wanted to do a scientific study on his work, this psychologist, he would have to figure out what he needs to support, right? He would have to figure out, okay, so I'm saying that all 3 of these things would have an effect on a person and who they are and how they interact with the world. So I need to figure out a way to show that each of these things does that in a person's life. Okay. And when you're doing writing, after I've gotten way in the weeds about psychology and science, when you're doing writing, you need to do the same thing. When you are presenting a new theory, you need to have research backing up your theory. And in some cases, that research needs to be across multiple different fields. When you are doing writing, you are trying to convey something with your writing. So the first thing you need to do when you're doing research is know what you need to convey. Or one of the first things. When you are writing, the first thing you need to do is know what you're trying to convey. So we're going to talk about a toaster in this sense. So you have an experience of a toaster, and you are trying to convey a specific experience about that toaster. When you're looking at that toaster, because it's an easy thing to understand, do you need to see all the inner workings of that toaster to convey that experience? Do you need to see that toaster in action, making toast, to actually convey that experience? Does the toaster need to feel alien to you? If the toaster is something that you've never seen before, it might be the case that you need to present it as if someone is seeing it anew, as if the reader is going to see it anew. Is it connected to something important in your life? Is that toaster connected to something important in your life? And you might be saying, well, that's ridiculous. Do you have a weird emotional connection to it, essentially? What you are trying to convey about that toaster will determine the info you need to convey. So again, taking a look back at science, you have to understand what shows support for your hypothesis before you start looking into doing the research on that. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead of this. So with the toaster, maybe you see the toaster as something really mundane, and it's something that bores you to death. So you're writing about that toaster, and you need to approach it from a very mundane direction. Now, maybe you're really interested in the moving parts of the toaster, and this would be like a technical manual, right? Or maybe it's the case that you're writing fiction, and you need a character to take apart a toaster and use it for something. So you actually need to know the inner workings of the toaster, and you need to convey those inner workings to someone. Maybe you love the toaster. Maybe somebody you love gave it to you, and therefore you have their sentimental value. Maybe you burned your hand on the toaster, so it makes you mad. And those are all different emotions. Those are all different situations. Those are all different experiences of just a toaster. So think about how complex you can get with your writing. Maybe you threw the toaster across the room at someone you love. And that's my favorite, actually. Okay, so what I would suggest, this is more on the more practical side of things, is maybe you're probably thinking, well, what should I do? How should I get to this? And at the beginning of this episode, I talked about brain vomiting to do first drafts. I think it was this episode. Gosh, it's been so long. When you write, first figure out why, what the experience is, what the experience you're trying to convey is. And I think this is probably one of the easiest parts. And maybe it's just an emotion, right? Maybe you say, man, this toaster is really boring. I'm really bored. I'm really apathetic. And this toaster is just making me even more apathetic because it's the most boring toaster in existence. Or maybe you're saying, man, like I feel regret because, or the character's feeling regret because the character threw the toaster across the room and it hit somebody they loved. And you're trying to use that toaster to epitomize that feeling, that experience. I'm not even sure that word would be the correct one. You're trying to encapsulate that experience in that toaster, which you definitely can do as a writer. So the first thing you're doing is you are figuring out why. The second thing I would suggest is just doing a brain vomit. And this is just a first draft. You're just writing about that toaster. You're just writing down that experience of that thing. And it doesn't have to be a toaster. I'm just using it because toasters are so fun. So you're just writing down the experience of that thing. And then if you're throwing the toaster across the room, as an example, you don't necessarily need to know all the inner workings of that toaster, but you might need to know what it looks like at rest before it starts getting thrown across the room. So this is where it gets into the case where you can actually show something in a book, in a story, in fiction, or even in real life, in like literary nonfiction. You could show the anger of a person by a toaster, by itself. For example, how I would do that is I would have the toaster sitting on the counter. Really simply doing this. And then at some point, you have the person picking up the toaster. And you have how hard the toaster it is in their hand. And after you have how hard it is in their hand, then you have the feeling of it leaving their hand and the feeling of how fast it left their hand. And then you have the toaster tumbling through the air. And then you have the whipping cord, right? And then the toaster slams into the wall, if it's going to slam into the wall. And you have the thud of the toaster on the wall. And then you have the toaster falling down. And you have the stasis of the toaster. What happened right there is I essentially just told a story with just a toaster. Because it's climbing action, it's falling action, it's the different parts of a story. Because you go from stasis to stasis, and at the end of the story, the toaster is in a different place than at the beginning. At the beginning of the story, the toaster was doing what it wanted to do. It loved sitting there. It loved making toast. At the end of the story, you just killed that toaster because you were mad at somebody. let me see, where am I at? So I'm getting off in the weeds a bit. I don't know where I'm at right now, honestly. So in that situation, I don't need to know the technical aspects of the toaster. I don't need to make that toaster boring at the beginning necessarily. I don't need to have maybe in the story, I could even make it more complex by making that toaster something someone gave someone, or something in the story you could really make it interesting is if that toaster was the possession of someone who died, and then you're chucking that toaster across the room at somebody else because you're angry. So it really could represent a lot in there. You could really carry a story just with that stinking toaster. And I'm getting ahead of here. So, like I said, do like a brain vomit, I guess, and you could do a really bad first draft. And then what you're doing is when you have that first draft, or even you don't even necessarily have to have a first draft. You could just explain the different you could just explain the different parts of the toaster, or you could just explain the feelings associated with the actions, like of throwing the toaster in this case, and then you just figure out what you need. For example, if you start talking about the inner workings of the toaster, and I'm bad at this, I put a lot of information into stuff that I shouldn't put in, and I should clean it up more. If you put the inner workings of the toaster into that story, where I'm throwing it across the room, I don't think it's going to do much for that story. One thing I want to convey with this, so this goes back to the scientific idea. Then there's one thing I want to talk about with set pieces, actually. So with a scientific idea, you're trying to figure out what you need, and then you're building that up into that theory, and you have all these little pieces coming together. And in the same way, you are taking all you need in writing, all the different details that you're going to need to convey the experience, and you're building it up into the writing in the best way you're able to. And it's really similar. I think that most forms of idea formation are related. I think that if you're making a logical argument, it's not perfectly related. It's not the same thing. It's just related. If you're making a logical argument that is related to science, the scientific method, and making a research study or whatever, and that is also related to writing, but it's also related to painting. It's also related to making music. You're trying to bring about something that didn't exist, and it's like making a bicycle. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So you're trying to figure out how you can bring all the parts you need together to make something new that goes beyond just the parts you have. Okay? And you can start with just the parts, and then you create something that didn't exist before. And hopefully the scientific method thing helps. It helps me a lot. And in some cases, it's hard to get to the point with it. But I don't know. I think it's helpful. And they are related. So study other things to learn how to write better. That's just my opinion right there. I don't have this huge scientific body of knowledge, to convey that. So about set pieces. If you don't know what a set piece is, it's something in the story. I typically like to think of it as a stage play set, and then you can apply that to pretty much anything. You can have a stage play set. It can really convey things in the story. For example, if I have two chairs, and I think I've seen a play like this where they have like a chair, and that's what their set is. And they have like a chair, they have two chairs, and that's all it is. And it's representative of something, maybe loneliness in the story. Or you could have a set that's really big. Some sets, and I know Phantom of the Opera is a very flashy play, but they're trying to convey a specific experience because of that play. There was a set I saw at my college, a play I saw at my college that was the retelling of Job. It was a really cool way of doing it. And they built this huge tower on the stage. This huge tower way up high. So and it was supposed to be like, there's the thing at the beginning of the story of Job where God and Satan speak. And that's what they were trying to convey. They had this huge height you're looking up to. And then they had everything else happen. But the whole entire play, there was this huge tower in the background that went up to heaven, as you might put it. And that had an effect on the people watching the play. You can think of set pieces as the set of a play, or you can think of set pieces as just the objects in a story. in the case of the toaster isn't acting by itself. The toaster is being used to tell the story. So even if you just think you need people to talk, remember that you can use objects in your story to tell the story. You can use the objects. A lot of people do it with nature. A lot of people do it with describing the room. You can convey a specific feeling in the room or in a place by describing it, right? You can convey a specific event. The event doesn't even have to take place in time, in the time you're writing it. It could take place beforehand, but it can be really powerful to use a set or a set piece, or whatever you want to call it, to convey a specific event. So use that to your advantage. It can help propel action forward. One of the stereotypical set pieces that helps propel action forward is the gun above the fireplace that eventually gets used, right? And it can also bring about a reaction from someone. One other thing a set piece can do, or an object in a story, is it can center an idea in the story. In the case of the toaster I was describing, you can do it with anything. You can do it with a pen, and it helps me a lot sometimes just to start really small and write around a very small thing. You could do it with a notebook. You could do it with a ring, anything. You could do it with a jug of milk, whatever. You could do it with that, and you center the story. It centers the story. It brings everything back to that thing, that object. In some cases, the object can be huge. It can be a whole entire set, like in a play, or the object can be something very, very small. Lord of the Rings revolves around a ring. Lord of the Rings revolves around a ring, and that ring represents, you could say it represents power, or represents temptation, but Lord of the Rings revolves around a ring. That whole entire story revolves around a tiny little object, and I would say that object actually helps propel the story forward, because that object, the thing about it is the object isn't just the object. The object in your story is conveying an abstract idea. So that's what's going on, and you're not necessarily stating that it conveys an abstract idea, but it does, and it should convey an abstract idea in your story. This is one of the few times I'm actually going to say that it should, if you're focusing on something. So it kind of goes back to use my toaster example. I'm not going to use a toaster flying through the room. So if you want to steal that, you can go for it. All right, our logical fallacy of the week. I totally lost my thing for logical fallacy of the week. Oh, here it is. Logical fallacy of the week is divine fallacy, and I've already done this before, so if it sounds familiar, there you go. A divine fallacy is saying something is so amazing that it must be from a superior, divine, or paranormal being. Like it's from I would say that you could say, it's like the pyramids. People think, the pyramids in Egypt are so amazing that some alien must have created these pyramids. It's just beyond belief that it must have happened. And I think that I think this divine fallacy really centers around something being so amazing that it comes from a divine source, in quotes, something beyond humans. I think that, if you're listening to this podcast, you've listened to other ones, you already know that I believe in God. So you already know that I wouldn't base belief in God off of this. I think there's other arguments for it. You can say whether you believe that or not, but that's what the divine fallacy centers around, that, it's so amazing, it's so unbelievable, it must come from this thing. When in some cases, we run into a lot of things that come from humans, or animals are making them, that are just, wow, I can't believe an animal created this. So that is the logical fallacy of the week. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions, or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over, and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.